Paradise Lost by John Milton. Book 1. The Argument. Of the first disobedience of men, and the fruit of the forbidden tree, the taste of which brought death and sorrow into the world, and barred us from paradise, until a greater man lead us back to the heavenly lands. Sing, sacred inspiration, you who in the secret mountain of Oreb, or in the Sinai desert, inspired the shepherd who first taught the chosen people, how in the beginning heaven and earth was created from disorder. Or if Sion Hill is your chosen spot, or Siloa stream which flowed swiftly past God's messenger, from there I call you to help me as I sing my ambitious song, which I don't intend to take the easy way above the mountain of inspiration, while it tries things never yet seen in either prose or poetry, and chiefly spirit which values more than temples the pure and honest heart. Guide me, for you have the wisdom from the start. You were there, and with your great wings spread out, sat like a dove perched upon the great gorge, and bred life from it. Shine a light into the darkness inside me. Lift up what is low, so that I can do justice to this great subject, and show the actions of God, and explain the ways of God to men. Because you see all that is in heaven and in the deep pit of hell, say, what made our grandparents, living that happy existence, so much blessed by heaven, break away from their Creator and disobey His orders, His one law, apart from which they were lords of the world? Who led them into that awful rebellion? The hellish snake. It was he whose cunning, driven by envy and revenge, tricked the mother of mankind, after his pride caused him to be thrown out of heaven with his army of rebel angels, with whose help he had planned to set himself up in heaven as the highest, thinking he could even take on the role of God if he fought him, and driven by ambition against the throne and kingship of God, started a blasphemous war in heaven, and fought proudly, but in vain. The Almighty power threw him down into the flames from the skies of heaven, with terrible flame and destruction, down to the bottomless pit of hell, to live there, bound in unbreakable chains, burned with punishing fire, for having dared challenge the Almighty to battle. For 9 days, as they are measured by men, he and his terrible gang lay beaten, thrashing in the fiery sea, defeated though still immortal. By his fate raised further anger in him, for now the thought of the happiness he had lost and the pain he now faces tortures him. He cast around his hate-filled eyes, which showed great pain and terror, mixed with unyielding pride and unmoving hate. As far as angels can see, he sees the terrible place, bleak and wild, a horrible dungeon, whose walls all around burned like one great oven, but from those flames there is no light, but a visible darkness which only showed things of sadness, lands of sorrow, miserable shadows, where peace and rest are unknown, where the hope that comes to all never comes, endless torture drives on forever, and there is a fiery storm, fed by sulfur which burns forever and never runs out. This was the place God's justice had made for those rebels. Here he had ordained their prison built in total darkness, and their allotted place was to be as far away from God and heaven's light as 3 times distance from the equator to the poles. Oh, how different it was to their former home. There those who fell with him, beaten down with floods and whirlwinds of stormy flames, he soon makes out, and in turmoil by his side is one almost equal in power, as bad in crime, who in later times appeared in Palestine, and his name was Beelzebub, the arch-enemy, who was now called Satan in heaven, with bold words breaking through the ghastly silence, spoke to him. Is that you? How you have fallen! How changed you are! from the one who in the happy lands of light, dressed in heavenly brightness, outshone so many others, though bright themselves. If it's you who joined with me in thought, plans, hope, and risk in our great adventure, then now we are joined again in suffering, in our destruction. You see the pit, how low we have fallen, which shows how much stronger God's thunder was. But before we fought him, who knew just how strong he was? But for all his strength and anything else the winner might do in his anger, I have no regret. I won't change my mind, even though my appearance has changed. I am staying true to my hatred, caused by my sense of injustice, which led me to take on the mighty in battle, and to bring along to the fight a numberless force of spirits who also hated his rule and preferred mine. We took on the ultimate power with the power of our own, in a hard-fought battle on the fields of heaven, and shook his throne. So what if we lost the battle? All is not lost. We shall keep our unquenchable ambition, and look out for revenge, hating forever, and be brave enough never to give in. And so, what has he truly won? All his strength and anger will never take that away from me. To bow and beg for pardon, unbended knee, and worship the power that so recently feared for his rule in the face of my own power, that would be too low. That would be a disgrace and shame far worse than this fall. The eternal laws state that our strength and this stuff we're made of cannot be destroyed. So, our experience in this great battle hasn't taken our strength and has increased our cunning, so we can hope for greater success as we set out to fight an everlasting war with strength and cunning, never giving in to our great enemy, who has won for now, and with great happiness has sole possession of the title of Tyrant of Heaven. So the rebel angel spoke, although he was in pain, boasting out loud, but inside torn with despair, and soon his arrogant comrade replied, "O Prince, the ruler over many thrones, who led the angels in armor to war under your orders, and with terrible deeds, without fear, challenged the power of heaven's eternal King and tested his mighty rule. Whether he won through strength or luck or fate, I can see and regret the terrible result all too well. Our terrible loss and casting down has barred us from heaven, and all this great army has been thrown down in ruin, as close to death as gods and heavenly forms can come, for the mind and spirit cannot be beaten, and strength will come back, even if all our light has been extinguished, and our happiness is drowned here in this endless suffering. But what if he who beat us, who I now must acknowledge as almighty in strength, since only such a one could have beaten our armies, has left our spirit and strength intact, so that we can better feel pain, so he can go on taking his revenge, or carry on serving him as slaves, his by right of victory, to order us, whatever he's up to work in the fire here in the heart of hell, to do his errands in these gloomy depths. In that case, how will it help us to feel undiminished strength or eternal life? It'll just help us to suffer eternal punishment." The leader of the demons swiftly replied, "Fallen angel, weakness is a miserable thing, inaction or in suffering, but I can promise you, we will never do anything good. To always do harm will be our only pleasure, because it will go against the desires of him we are fighting. If God tries to create good from our evil, then we must work to twist his goal and make sure that evil comes out of good. This might happen often and perhaps cause him grief if my plans work and knock his most cherished plans off course. But look, the furious winner has called back his angels of revenge who chased us to the gates of heaven. The fiery hail that stormed after us has blown out now. the wave of fire that followed us as we fell from the edge of heaven, and the thunder, accompanied by red lightning and furious anger, has perhaps been exhausted and has stopped bellowing through this huge and bottomless pit. Let's not miss our chance. Whether it is contempt or the end of his anger that makes our enemy give it to us. Do you see that miserable plain, abandoned and wild, desolate without light, apart from the flicker which these angry flames give, pale and horrid? Let us go there, away from these waves of fire, and rest if there is any rest to be had there, and gather up our damaged forces, debate how from now on we can do most damage to our enemy, how we can make up for our loss, how we can overcome this terrible disaster, how we can get strength from hope, or at least how we can gain determination from despair. Thus Satan spoke to his lieutenant, with his head lifted above the waves, and his eyes burning with fire. The rest of him laid out on the lake of fire, stretching far and wide, over many acres, as huge as the one named in the legends as being of monstrous size, Titan, or the one born of earth, who battled Jupiter, Briareus and Typhon, who lurked in his cave by ancient Tarsus, or the sea monster Leviathan, the biggest thing God created which swims in the oceans' currents. When he might be sleeping in the Norwegian Sea, the sailors say often the pilot of some small craft, caught out at night, thinks that he's an island and fixes an anchor in his scaly skin, ties up in the shelter of his side, while night rules the sea and keeps off the hoped for morning. So the chief demon lay, his great length stretched out, chained to the burning lake from which he could never have arisen, except that the will and the permission of all-powerful heaven left him to carry on in his own evil plans, so that by repeating his crimes he might draw further punishment down on himself as he tried to do wrong to others, and to his fury he would see how his evil only brought out infinite goodness, grace, and mercy given to the man he tried to pervert, but on himself a triple dose of horror, anger, and vengeance was poured. He pulls his great bulk upright from the pool, on either side of the flames, with their leaping points blown backwards, rolled away in waves, leaving a horrid valley in the center. Then, with his wings outstretched, he took off into the dark air, which felt unusually heavy, until he came to dry land and landed, if it could be called land, that burned with a solid fire just as the lake burned with liquid fire. In color it was like a hill when the force of underground winds move it, tears it away from the Pelorus, or from the broken slopes of thunderous Mount Etna, whose burning and powerful innards kindled fire, fueled by dissolved minerals, and leave the lands around burnt and wrapped in stench and smoke. Such was the land the souls of the cursed fleet found. His lieutenant followed, both of them happy to have escaped the hellish flood like gods, and having done it under their own steam, not with the permission of the divine power. Is this the country, the land, the atmosphere? Said the fallen archangel. Is this the place that we must swap for heaven, this mournful gloom for that heavenly light? So be it, because he who rules can now order things as he wishes. It's best to be furthest from him whose genius is equal to and whose force is greater than others. Farewell to the happy fields where joy lives forever. Welcome, horrors. Welcome the world of devils, and you, deepest hell, welcome your new master, one who brings a mind that will not be changed by its place or by time. The mind is a place in itself, and inside it one can turn heaven into hell, or hell into heaven. Who cares where I am? If I'm still the same, then why should I be any different just because he was made greater by force? Here we will be free at last. God didn't build this place for himself. He won't make us leave. Here we shall rule undisturbed, and in my opinion, to rule is something worth wanting, even in hell. It's better to rule in hell than be a servant in heaven. But why are we letting our trusty friends, our comrades and sharers in our loss, lie so shocked on the uncaring lake? Why are we not calling them to take their place in this cursed house, and telling them to gather up their strength and see what might still be taken back from heaven or lost in hell? This was how Satan spoke, and Beelzebul answered him, Leader of those bright armies, which only the Almighty could have beaten, if they could just hear that voice which gave them hope in fear and danger, heard so often when things were blackest and on the fearful edge of the raging battle. In all their attacks it was their greatest hope. If they hear it now, they will soon get new hope and rise up, even though at the moment they are lying groveling in that lake of fire, as we were a short while ago, stunned and shocked, and no wonder after falling from such a terrible height. He had hardly finished when the senior devil started off to the shore, his great shield forged in heaven, heavy, large, and round. Slung on his back, the great circle hung on his shoulders like the moon, the ball which Galileo watches through his telescope in the evening from the hill town of Fiesole, or from the Arno Valley, seeking out new lands, rivers, or mountains in her spotted globe. His spear, which was equal in height to the tallest pine cut down in the hills of Norway to make a mast for a ship of some great admiral, was just a stick he leaned on to help his cautious steps over the burning clay, not like the steps he took in the blue of heaven and the oppressive atmosphere beating down as well, surrounded by fire. Nonetheless he suffered it, until upon the shore of the burning sea he stood and called his armies, the angelic forms which lay unconscious, as thick as the leaves of autumn which lie on the streams of Valabronsa, where the Tuscan shade covers all, or like the scattered seaweed floating when the storms of Orion has attacked the Red Sea coast with the waves which overthrew the Pharaoh and his Egyptian cavalry, who, with wicked hatred, chased the Israelites, who saw from the safety of the shore their floating corpses and broken chariot wheels. This was how thick they lay, the pitiful and lost who covered the surface, stunned by the terrible thing that had happened to them. He called out so loudly that the whole pit of hell echoed with it. Princes, rulers, warriors who were once the pride of heaven, we've lost. Can this sort of amazement overcome eternal spirits? Or have you decided this is the place, after the efforts of battle, to rest your tired strength, as if it was so easy to sleep here as it was in the vales of heaven? Or have you promised to lie down like this to worship the one who beat you, the one who now sees cherub and seraphim rolling around in the flood, with all their weapons and flags scattered, so that soon those who chased us from heaven's gates will see they have the upper hand, and coming closer, smash us as we rest here, or with bolts of lightning pin us to the floor of this pit? Wake up, get up, or you'll be lost forever. They heard and were ashamed, and they leapt up into the air like men on sentry duty, caught sleeping by their sergeant, who get moving before they are properly awake. It was not as though they were blind to the terrible situation they were in, or not feel the awful pains, but they obeyed their commander's voice, flocking in their multitudes. Like when the wand of Moses in the bad times in Egypt waved round the shores and summoned the dark clouds of locusts sailing on the east wind, that hung over the kingdom of the unholy Pharaoh like night and darkened all the lands of the Nile. This was how numberless was the crowd of fallen angels hovering on their wings under the roof of hell, between the fires above, below, and all around, until, like a beacon, the upraised spear of their great ruler led them on their journey, and they landed on the firm brimstone and covered the plain. Such a crowd the well-populated northern lands never poured from her frozen loins, crossing the Rhines or the Danube, when their barbarian sons crashed like a flood upon southern Europe, spreading from Gibraltar to the Libyan deserts. At once, every platoon and company sent their leaders quickly up to where their great commander stood. They were shaped like gods, far grander than humans and their princes, these powers that had sat on thrones in heaven. Though in the records of heaven their names were not remembered now, scratched and erased from the books of life by their rebellion. Nor had they from mankind yet been given new names until as they roamed the earth by great God's allowance, in order to test mankind, with lies and deceit they managed with most of mankind to corrupt them and persuade them to abandon God their Creator and the invisible glory of the one who made them, to change often into animals, dressed up with bright religions full of ceremony and luxury, worshipping devils as their gods. Then the devils were known to men by various names, and worshipped as idols throughout the godless world. Divine inspiration, what are their names, first and last? Who awoke from that bed of fire at the call of their great emperor and came to him, where he stood on the bare shore as the next in rank, while the thronging crowd stood back? These were the leaders who, from the pit of hell, roaming the earth to look for their prey on earth, dared to set their thrones up next to the throne of God, their altars next to his altar, and became gods loved amongst all nations, and dared defy Jehovah thundering out of Israel on his throne amongst his angels. They often even put their shrines within his holy places, foul objects, and with evil things they polluted his holy ritual and sacred feasts, daring to incite his light with their darkness. For there is Moloch, horrible king covered with the blood of human sacrifice, and also with parents' tears, who, through the noise of the drums and tambourines, couldn't hear their children's cries as they were burnt in front of his foul statue. It was him the Ammonites worshipped in Rabbah on her flooded plains, in Argob and in Basan, as far as the river of faraway Arnon. Not content with such a daring invasion, he tricked the wisest man, Solomon, into building his temple right next to the temple of God on the hill of corruption, and invaded the lovely valley of Hinnom, which afterwards was called Tophet, and Gehenna, the valley of the damned. Next came Chemos, the foul curse of the sons of Moab, who stretched his rule from Areora to Nebo, and the wilds of southerly Abiram, to Hesebon and Heronium, in the land of Sihon, beyond the fruitful valley of Sibmah, dressed in vines, and from Eliel to the Dead Sea. He was also called Peor, when he tempted the Israelites, stopped in Sittim on the march from the Nile, to worship him with obscene ceremonies, for which they were punished. From there he spread his foul orgies even to the Mount of Olives, next to Moloch's murderous valley, putting lust next door to hate, until the good man Josiah drove them back into hell. Along with them came the ones known in the lands between Euphrates and the river which separates Egypt from Syria, by the general names of Baalim and Ashtaroth, the one male, the other female. For when spirits wish to, they can be either men or women, or both. Their essential substance is so soft and moldable, not chained to joints or limbs, or relying on the fragile strength of bones and heavy flesh, but choosing whatever shape they wish, expanded or contracted. bright or dark, they can carry out their supernatural missions, completing their work of love or evil. The people of Israel often rejected him who gave them their power and left empty his true altar, bowing down low to these filthy gods. As punishment, they were bowed down just as low in battle, sinking under the spears of despicable enemies. Along with these came Astoreth, called by the Phoenicians as Astarte, queen of heaven with her curved horns. Her to whose statue, every night under the moonlight, Sidonian virgins gave their promises in songs, which were also sung in Israel, where she had her temple on the Mount of Olives, built by the often married King Solomon, who thought he had a great heart, was led astray by beautiful idol worshippers and became an idolater himself. Tammuz was the next in line, whose death in Lebanon drew each year the Syrian ladies to bewail his fate with songs of love on a summer's day, while the river Adonis ran from his home mountain to the sea, colored purple, purposefully with the blood of Tammuz newly wounded each year. The romantic story infected the daughters of Israel with similar desire, and their abandoned behavior in the sacred doorway of the temple was seen by Ezekiel when they were under the influence of the vision, and he saw with his eyes the evil idolatry of Judah separated from God. Next came the one who mourned deeply when the captured ark damaged his Brutus statue, with its head and hands broken off in his own temple, on the edge of the threshold, where it fell flat on his face and embarrassed his worshippers. Dagon was his name, a sea monster with a man's torso and a fish's tail. But he had his temple venerated in Azotus. He was feared all along the coast of Palestine, as well as in Gath and Ascalon, and in Akoran, and on the frontiers of Gaza. Following him came Rimmon, whose beautiful home was lovely Damascus, on the fertile banks of the shining streams of Abana and Parthar. He also was a fighter of the house of God. He once lost a leper as a worshipper, but gained a king, Ahaz, his drunken ruler, whom he persuaded to disrespect and replace God's altar with one of the Syrian type, on which he could burn his revolting sacrifices and worship the gods whom he had beaten. After these came a group who, under their ancient famous names, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and their followers, with terrible appearances and magic, forced the raving Egypt and her priests to look for their gods in brutish characters rather than in the shape of a man. Nor did Israel escape their madness when their borrowed gold was made into the carved idol of Oreb, and Jeroboam the rebel king made that sin twice as bad in Bethel and in Dan, comparing his creator to an ox in the field, Jehovah, who, on one night as he passed through Egypt, destroyed with a single bow both her firstborn children and all her bleating gods. Last came Belaliah, who had no rival in his obscenity. In all who fell from heaven, none had such a disgusting love of vice for his own sake. No temple was built for him, and no fires were lit on altars, and yet who was more often presented than him in temple and at altars as when the priest becomes an unbeliever, as Eli's sons did, who filled the house of God with lust and violence. He also rules in courts and palaces, and in the rich cities, where the noise of the riotous behavior rises above their tallest towers, as does the sound of fighting and outrages. And when night darkens the street, then the sons of Belial come out, driven by arrogance and drunkenness. This was seen in the streets of Sodom, and that night in Gibeah, when the house which had been given hospitality surrendered their women to save the men from rape. These were the main devils, greatest in power. There were too many others to name, although they were worshipped far and wide. The Greek gods, believed to be descended from Javan and worshipped as gods in later a time than heaven and earth, their alleged parents, Titan, the first child of heaven with his massive offspring, his inheritance stolen by his younger Saturn, who from his own son would rear mighty Jupiter, got the same treatment. So Jupiter ruled as their usurper. These gods were first known to the Cretans and to Ida. Then on the snowy summit of cold Olympus they ruled the skies, the highest heaven they knew. And they also ruled in Delphi and in Dodona and all through the lands of Greece, and with ancient Saturn spread over the Adriatic to Italy, and were worshipped by the Celts in the British Isles. All of these and others gathered round, but they looked depressed and damp, though there were some who showed some little signs of happiness, to find that their leader was not downcast and to find that all was not completely lost, though on his face the same emotion showed. But he soon summoned up his usual arrogance, and with elevated speech which had apparent value but held no substance, gently encouraged their weakened strength and banished their fears. Then he commands at once that to the warlike sound of loud trumpets and bugles they should raise his mighty flag. The honor of doing that was claimed by Azrael, a tall cherub at his right. Straightway he unfurled from the shining pole the emperor's banner, which waving on high shone like a meteor, flapping in the wind, covered in jewels and embroidery in rich gold, with the seraphs' insignia and signs. All the time the trumpets were blowing warlike calls. At these signs the great crowd let out a shout which tore through the lands of hell, and beyond that brought fear to the kingdoms of chaos and of ancient night. Suddenly in the gloom there appeared 10,000 banners waving in the air, covered in the colors of the Orient, and with them rose up a great forest of spears, and a great throng of helmets appeared alongside ranks of shields so thick that they could not be counted. Soon they moved in perfect drill to the Greek music of flutes and soft recorders, the like of which raised the heroes of old to the peaks of noble purpose as they armed for battle, and in place of anger called them to be brave, firm and steadfast, fearing surrender or retreat as they feared death. It had the power to lessen and soften troubled thought with its touch, and chase away anguish, doubt, fear, sorrow and pain from the minds of gods and men. So they, breathing as on, being of the same purpose, marched on in silence to the soft music of the charming pipes, which eased the pain of their steps over the burning ground. And now they can be seen advancing, a horrible line of terrible size and dazzling weaponry, looking like ancient warriors arranged with their spears and shields, waiting to hear what orders their mighty leader had to give them. He ran his experienced eye over the armed rank, and soon has examined the whole army, lined up in their order, with the faces and stature of gods, and he counts their number. And now his heart swells with pride, and he revels in his power. For since man was created, never had he raised such a force as this. Compared to this, they were like the pygmies, trampled by cranes as they washed to the sea. Even if all the giants of Fulgra joined up with the race of heroes who fought at Thebes and Troy, each side having lesser gods fighting with them, and if they were added what is told in song and story of Arthur, son of Uther, surrounded by British and Norman knights, and all of those, Christian or pagan, who were jousted in Aspremont and Montauban, Damascus or Morocco or Trebizond, and the army sent out from Tunisia, leaving the African shore, which defeated Charlemagne and all his nobles in Fontabria. This was how these were seen. so far beyond any comparison with the armies of men, by their terrible leader. Above the rest, with a great stature and noble gestures, he rose like a tower. He had not altogether lost his God-given brightness, and he still looked a little like an archangel, though ruined, and with some of his glory hidden, like the sun when it rises seen through the low misty air, visible but with no sunbeams, or when it is hidden behind the moon in an eclipse and throws a grim twilight over half the world, and makes kings fear that it predicts their overthrow. Darkened in this way, but still shining more than the rest, was the archangel, but his face was scarred by thunder with deep frown lines, and care showed on his darkened cheek, but these were under brows which showed bravery unbowed, and scheming pride plotting its revenge. His gaze was cruel, but showed signs of guilt and feeling when he looked on his partners in crime, or rather his followers, once seen so different in paradise, condemned now to spend eternity in suffering. Millions of spirits barred from heaven for his crime, banished from the eternal glories for his rebellion. Yet how loyally they stood there, their glory destroyed, as when the lightning has signed the oaks in the forest, or the mountain pines with burnt tops still stand tall, though without greenery, upon the blasted heath. He now prepared to speak, and so they curved their line from end to end, making a semicircle around him. For all his comrades, they were silent in anticipation. 3 times he tried to speak, and 3 times, in spite of his contempt for them, he wept tears in the way which angels do. At last, he managed to get his words out, mixed with